Iris Caldwell handed over 2 dimes for a building that had stood empty for 28 years. The funeral home looked like it should have cost nothing, maybe less than nothing, considering someone would eventually need to demolish it. But Vincent Mercer took those 20 cents with a tight smile, signed the deed without reading it twice, and left faster than a man should leave something he just sold. Iris stood there holding the paper, watching Mercer disappear down Ashford Street, and felt the first cold thread of doubt pull tight in her chest. Why would anyone sell a commercial building, even a decaying one, for less than the cost of a cup of coffee? The Whitmore Funeral Home's brick facade had crumbled in places, exposing the wooden frame beneath like exposed bone. Black mold crept up the walls in organic patterns that looked almost deliberate, spreading like dark veins across the pale stone. The iron gates had rusted shut, frozen in place for nearly 3 decades, as if time itself had decided this place should remain closed forever. The brass nameplate that once read Whitmore and Sons as test, 1,881 inches, hung at an angle, one screw missing, the other barely holding. Most women would see a demolition project and a hefty cleanup bill. Iris saw salvageable fixtures, antique furniture, ornate light fixtures, maybe copper piping she could sell. Simple arithmetic. 20 cents in, maybe 800 out if she worked it smart. She'd been scraping by for 2 years since the divorce, working 3 part-time jobs just to keep her small apartment. This could be the break she needed. But when Iris stepped inside with Pepper at her heels, the arithmetic stopped making sense. The tortoise-shell cat froze 3 steps past the threshold, her amber eyes wide, every muscle drawn tight beneath her patched coat. Pepper never acted like that. Not around dogs, not around strangers, not around anything that belonged in the world. Iris understood. The cat had been her constant companion through the divorce, through the eviction from her house, through every hardship. Pepper feared nothing. Until now. The air inside tasted wrong, thick and chemical, like breathing through gauze soaked in formaldehyde that had sat in the dark for decades. Something else lingered beneath it, something organic and sweet that made Iris's stomach turn. She'd worked briefly as a hospital orderly years ago, and this smell reminded her of the morgue, but older, more concentrated, as if death itself had soaked into the walls and fermented. And the rooms, those silent viewing rooms, seemed to stretch in ways the outside never suggested. Distances felt distorted. The main chapel looked 30 feet deep from the doorway, but when Iris walked its length, she counted 42 steps. Hallways didn't end where they should. Corners met at angles that seemed wrong, creating shadows that pooled in impossible places. Iris ran her hand along the mahogany paneling and felt a cold vibration pass through the wood, as if the building itself held something beneath its surface, something that had been waiting. The wood was smooth, polished, pristine despite nearly 3 decades of abandonment. That was wrong too. Everything should have been covered in dust, but the surfaces looked recently cleaned, as if someone had been maintaining this place in secret. Pepper pressed hard against her leg and gave a low, uneasy hiss that Iris hadn't heard since the cat was a kitten she'd rescued from behind a dumpster. The sound raised goosebumps along Iris's arms. That night, back in her cramped apartment, Iris couldn't stop thinking about Mercer's quick exit, about the deed signed too fast, about the way the building seemed to hold its breath when no wind touched it, as if the 20 cents had not bought a structure at all, but something trapped inside it. She pulled out her laptop and searched for information about the Whitmore Funeral Home. The results were sparse, oddly so for a building that had operated for over a century. A few mentions in historical records, a brief obituary for the last owner, who died in 1997, but nothing about why it had been abandoned or who'd been maintaining it all these years. The property record showed it had changed hands 6 times in the past 28 years, but always for impossibly small amounts. 50 cents, $1, 3/4. Each owner had held it for less than a month before selling it again. Iris felt that cold thread of doubt pulled tighter. 3 weeks before Iris Caldwell bought the funeral home, she counted the bills in the shoebox under her bed and knew she wouldn't make it through October. $112 and change stood between her and homelessness. Between her and the kind of desperation that makes a person consider things they swore they never would. Her apartment, a studio above an Indian restaurant in the riverside district of Hollowmere, barely sheltered her and Pepper. Most nights the cat ate better than she did, and Iris would not have it any other way. She was 34 years old and felt 60. The divorce had taken everything, the house, the savings, even her confidence. Her ex-husband had been a lawyer, good at manipulating systems, better at making her look unstable during the proceedings. She'd walked away with her clothes, her cat, and a crushing sense of failure. Now she worked mornings at a coffee shop, afternoons doing data entry from home, and evenings cleaning offices. 3 jobs that barely added up to survival. She'd learned to skip meals, to wear the same clothes until they fell apart, to calculate every expense down to the penny. The shoebox under her bed represented 2 months of skipped lunches and walked miles to save bus fare. She was outside the county clerk's office, returning paperwork for one of her data entry clients, when she overheard 2 municipal workers talking. Their words drifted through the autumn air like a lifeline or a noose, and you don't know which until it's around your neck. One said Vincent Mercer was desperate to unload the old Whitmore Funeral Home. The other laughed, said no one would touch that cursed wreck unless Mercer paid them to level it. But Iris heard something else. $800 in architectural salvage if a woman worked hard enough. Victorian light fixtures alone could bring 200. Antique furniture, another 3. Copper piping, stained glass, brass hardware, it all added up. That evening, she found Mercer at the edge of downtown beside a Tesla that cost more than she'd earned in 5 years. Mercer was older, maybe 60, silver hair combed neat, clothes worth more than Iris made in 6 months. His eyes shifted sideways when he spoke, never quite meeting hers. Iris had learned during her marriage to distrust men who wouldn't hold your gaze. When Iris mentioned the funeral home, Mercer's shoulders went rigid, just for a moment, then his expression smoothed into something practiced and empty. You want to buy it? Depends on the price. 20 cents. Iris stared. Commercial property had value simply for existing. Even condemned buildings sold for thousands, if only for the land they sat on. She thought she'd misheard. The traffic noise on Ashford Street was loud. I'm sorry, what? 20 cents. 2 dimes. Take it or leave it. Mercer already had the deed in hand, already holding out a pen. His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped it. I want it gone, off my conscience. That word, conscience, caught like a fishhook in Iris's chest. It was the same word her ex-husband had used when he'd taken everything in the divorce. For the good of my conscience, he'd said, as if stealing her security was somehow moral. But Iris signed. She dug into her purse for the 2 dimes she'd been saving for laundry detergent, and Mercer practically threw the deed at her before walking away. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, just climbed into his Tesla and drove off like something was chasing him. Iris stood alone on the sidewalk, holding the paper, wondering what kind of building weighed so heavy on a man's soul that he'd sell it for pocket change. Wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if she'd finally caught a break. The deed felt heavier than it should in her hands. Iris returned to the Whitmore Funeral Home the next morning with Pepper, perched in a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and a toolbox borrowed from her downstairs neighbor. The walk took 40 minutes through streets lined with abandoned storefronts and graffiti-covered walls. This part of Hollowmere had been dying for a decade, businesses fleeing for the suburbs, leaving behind shells and memories. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mercer's face, that momentary rigidity in his shoulders when she'd mentioned the building, heard that tremor in his voice when he said conscience, felt the way he'd almost thrown the deed at her, desperate to be rid of it. A woman didn't sell commercial property for 20 cents unless something was very wrong with it, or unless something was very right with it, and she needed it gone before anyone noticed which. The funeral home looked worse in full morning light. The brick had darkened to the color of dried blood, and the mold on the walls had spread like a disease, eating through mortar and wood until they looked ready to collapse at a touch. The chapel's stained glass windows were intact, but filthy, filtering the sunlight into 6 shades of yellow and green that made the interior glow like something infected. Iris circled the building twice before going inside, studying the structure, looking for collapse or foundation damage or anything that would explain the price. She'd worked construction one summer during college, before she'd met her ex-husband, before everything had gone wrong. She knew enough to spot serious problems. The building leaned slightly westward, but the foundation looked solid. The brick, despite the mold, showed no major cracks. The roof sagged in one corner but hadn't collapsed. Strange. A structure this old, abandoned this long, should have deteriorated more, should have been condemned, demolished, recycled into the earth, the way everything eventually is. Pepper shifted in the bag, making a low sound in her throat. Not quite a hiss, not quite a growl, something in between, something Iris had never heard before. "It's okay, girl," Iris whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. She approached the main entrance. The double doors were oak, thick and heavy, with small windows of frosted glass. Someone had padlocked them from the outside, but the lock was old, rusted. Iris used bolt cutters from the toolbox, and the lock fell away with barely any resistance, as if it had been waiting to open. The doors swung inward silently. No creak, no resistance. The hinges had been oiled recently. That was wrong. This building had been empty for 28 years. Who had oiled the hinges? Pepper went rigid in the bag, every muscle tense. The cat's claws dug into the canvas, trying to climb out, trying to escape. Iris had never seen her act this way. Not once in the 6 years since she'd found the kitten abandoned and starving. Pepper had faced dogs 3 times her size without flinching, had stared down a raccoon that tried to get into their apartment. The cat feared nothing, until now. "It's just a building," Iris said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to convince herself as much as the cat, but when she stepped inside, she understood why Pepper was terrified. The air felt different here. Heavier, denser, like breathing underwater, or like standing at the bottom of a well, and the smell, that chemical tang she'd noticed yesterday, was stronger now, sharp enough to make her eyes water. It reminded her of the smell in hospitals, that medicinal scent mixed with something sweeter, something organic and deeply wrong. She set the toolbox down, and pulled out the battery-powered lantern she'd brought. The funeral home had no electricity, no gas. She'd checked with the utility companies that morning. Everything had been shut off in 1997 when the last owner died. She lit the lantern and held it high. The light pushed back the darkness, but somehow made everything look worse. The viewing rooms were lined with empty casket pedestals, their velvet coverings rotted and torn in places, but inexplicably pristine in others, as if decay itself couldn't decide whether this place was abandoned or still in use. On the walls, water stains formed patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate, almost like architectural blueprints, like someone had traced plans directly onto the plaster with brown water. Iris stepped closer to one wall, studying the patterns. They weren't random. They showed rooms, hallways, chambers, a map of something beneath the building. Her heart began to beat faster. Iris moved deeper into the funeral home, her boots echoing on the marble floor. The sound was wrong. It should have been a simple click, rubber on stone, but instead, each step produced a hollow resonance that suggested vast space beneath the floor, like walking on the roof of a cave. She knelt and knocked on the marble with her knuckles. The sound that came back was unmistakable. Hollow, definitely hollow. There was something beneath this building, something big. Iris stood and walked to the back wall of the main chapel, the one where the water stains were most concentrated, and knocked again. Same hollow echo, deeper this time. She pressed her shoulder against the wall and pushed. The panels gave slightly, flexing inward, more than they should. Old plaster was supposed to be rigid, brittle, ready to crack rather than bend. This felt almost soft, like the wall was not really a wall, but something pretending to be one. She wedged a crowbar from the toolbox into a seam between two panels and pried. The plaster resisted, then suddenly gave with a crack that echoed through the empty chapel like a gunshot. Pepper yowled sharp and urgent, scrambling out of the canvas bag. Iris froze, crowbar trembling in her grip, lantern swaying. Behind the wall she'd just removed, there was not another wall or insulation or brick. There was a staircase, stone steps descending into absolute darkness. And from somewhere deep below, she heard something that sounded almost like the hum of machinery, steady and rhythmic, like the building had a heartbeat, like something down there was still running, still waiting. Iris stood at the top of those stairs, staring into the darkness, and realized that Vincent Mercer hadn't sold her a funeral home at all. He'd sold her a secret. Iris descended the stone stairs slowly, the lantern casting wild shadows on walls that looked far older than the funeral home above. Each step was worn smooth in the center, the stone polished by countless footsteps over what must have been decades, maybe centuries. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and that chemical smell intensified until it burned the back of her throat. Pepper followed reluctantly, staying close to Iris's ankles, the cat's tail puffed to twice its normal size. The stairs ended in a narrow corridor lined with iron doors, 12 of them, 6 on each side, stretching into the darkness beyond her lantern's reach. Each door bore a small brass plate with a number etched into it in ornate script, 1 through 12. Iris's throat went dry. These weren't storage rooms. They were crypts, private burial chambers for wealthy families, the kind that fell out of fashion a century ago when public cemeteries became the norm. But why were they hidden? Why the secret entrance? She approached the first door and found it unlocked, the handle turning smoothly despite its obvious age. Inside, the small chamber was empty, except for a stone shelf built into the wall and a leather-bound ledger sitting on top of it, placed there as if someone expected it to be found. Iris opened the ledger carefully, the pages crackling with age, the leather binding cracked but intact. Names, dozens of names, each followed by a date and a location. But these weren't burial records. Next to each name was a property address in Hollowmere and a sum of money. Small amounts, impossibly small amounts. Thornbury Estate, 45 cents, March 1887. Riverside Heights, 80 cents, June 1889. Blackwell Manor, 30 cents, November 1892. Camden Acres, 65 cents, February 1895. The list went on and on. 12 properties over 40 years, all sold for pocket change to a single buyer. Vincent Mercer's great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Mercer. Iris felt ice form in her stomach. This wasn't just history. This was a pattern. The same pattern that had led to her buying this building for 20 cents. She moved to the second crypt, her hands shaking now. Another ledger, this one containing death certificates, yellowed and brittle, but the dates didn't match the property sales. They came after, sometimes days after, sometimes just hours after. Fire, drowning, accident, sudden illness, trampling by horse. The causes varied, but the timing was precise. Every family that initially refused to sell lost someone within a week. Then they sold. Iris's breath came faster. She was looking at evidence of systematic murder spanning 4 decades. The Mercer family hadn't built their fortune through business acumen. They'd built it on corpses. In the third crypt, she found something that made her blood run cold. A metal strongbox, ornate and locked, sitting on the stone shelf, like an offering in a temple. The lock was old but solid. Iris used the crowbar, leveraging it against the hasp, until the metal screamed and gave way. Inside were deeds, original property deeds, the paper thick and expensive, the kind used for important documents in the 19th century. But these deeds told a different story than the ledgers. These showed the real prices, the amounts the properties were actually worth. The Thornbury estate, sold in the ledger for 45 cents, had been appraised at $8,000 in 1887. The Riverside Heights property, listed at 80 cents, was worth $12,000. Every property had been stolen for a fraction of a percent of its value, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth that reeked of preservative chemicals, was a map. Iris unfolded it carefully, spreading it across the stone shelf. The map showed downtown Hollowmere, but from 1890, when the city was just beginning to boom. 12 properties marked in red ink. 12 families who'd owned the most valuable land in what would become the city's commercial and financial district. Iris's hands shook as she unfolded a letter tucked beneath the map. The handwriting was elegant, each letter perfectly formed, but the words were cold as a January grave. The city will be built on our terms. Those who resist will be removed. Those who comply will be forgotten. The crypts will hold the proof until all who remember are dust. Let this record stand as testament to the Mercer legacy, built on the weakness of lesser men who could not protect what was theirs. It was signed by Cornelius Mercer, dated December 1899. Iris sat on the cold stone floor, the lantern flickering beside her, pepper pressed against her leg, and understood. The Mercer family hadn't just stolen land. They'd created a system of terror that lasted 40 years, killing anyone who stood in their way, forcing families to sell for nothing, then hiding the evidence in a crypt beneath a funeral home they owned. A place where bodies and secrets could rest together, undisturbed,
protected by the sanctity of death itself. The 12 properties on that 1890 map were now the 12 most valuable blocks in Hollowmere. The Thornbury estate was now Thornbury Tower, a 40-story office building. Riverside Heights was the Riverside Financial Center. Blackwell Manor had become Blackwell Plaza, home to the city's most expensive retail stores. All owned by Mercer Holdings, the family corporation that controlled a third of downtown.
Vincent Mercer hadn't sold her a funeral home for 20 cents. He'd sold her a confession vault worth $33 million in modern real estate, calculated based on the original theft. And he'd done it because someone, somewhere, was starting to ask questions. The city was planning a historical survey of downtown properties. Journalists were writing retrospectives about Hollowmere's founding families. Questions about how the Mercers had acquired so much land so quickly were beginning to surface. Better to let some desperate woman discover it and take the blame when the truth came out. Better to distance himself from the evidence before it destroyed his family's reputation and fortune. Iris heard footsteps on the stairs above, multiple sets, moving quickly. She grabbed the strongbox, shoved the ledgers and deeds back inside, along with the map and letter, and looked for another exit. The corridor extended beyond the 12 crypts into deeper darkness. Pepper's ears swiveled toward the far end of the hall, and the cat took off running, as if she knew something Iris didn't. There was another way out. There had to be. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing off stone walls. Iris ran into the darkness, following Pepper's small form, the strongbox clutched against her chest, the lantern swinging wildly in her other hand. Behind her, she heard voices, men's voices, rough and urgent. "She's down here somewhere. Find her. Mercer wants that box back." Iris spent 3 days hiding in a motel on the outskirts of Hollowmere, paying cash she couldn't afford, the strongbox hidden under the bed, while she tried to figure out what to do. She'd escaped through an old smuggling tunnel that connected the funeral home to the basement of an abandoned warehouse 3 blocks away. Pepper had known the way somehow, as if the cat could sense safe passage. Now Iris sat on the cheap motel bed, papers spread around her, trying to understand the full scope of what she'd found. The ledgers told the story of systematic theft and murder. The deeds proved the properties had been stolen. The map showed the scale of the crime. The letter provided direct evidence of intent and confession. This was enough to destroy the Mercer family, enough to trigger investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges. The descendants of the 12 families might be able to claim compensation. The city might be able to seize improperly obtained assets. Vincent Mercer could face charges for concealing evidence of crimes, even if the original crimes were beyond the statute of limitations. $33 million. That's what the lawyer she'd secretly consulted had estimated the case was worth. The stolen properties, adjusted for inflation and lost generational wealth, plus punitive damages. But Iris had no allies, no resources, no way to fight a family that owned half the city and could hire armies of lawyers to bury her in paperwork. She'd called the police the first night, and the detective who'd answered had listened politely, then suggested she might be mistaken, that old records were often incomplete, that she should be careful about making accusations against prominent citizens. The detective's name had been Mercer, a cousin maybe, or just someone on the payroll. That's when Iris realized she couldn't do this alone. She pulled out her laptop and started searching for the descendants of the 12 families named in the ledgers. It took hours of digging through genealogy websites, obituaries, social media, but she found them. Not all of them, but enough. 7 families still had living descendants in Hollowmere or nearby. She started making calls. The first person who agreed to meet her was a woman named Delilah Thornbury, 68 years old, living in a small apartment in East Hollowmere. Iris showed her the ledger entry for the Thornbury estate, showed her the death certificate for her great-great-grandfather, who died in a suspicious fire 3 days after refusing to sell his land. Delilah stared at the papers with tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she whispered, "about how we'd once been wealthy, how the family had owned land downtown. Everyone thought she was senile, making up fairy tales. But it was true. It was all true. Will you help me?" Iris asked. "Will you stand with me when I take this to the authorities?" Delilah nodded, her wrinkled hands gripping the edge of the table. "Yes, for my grandmother. For everyone who was told they were crazy for remembering." The second was a man named Jonas Blackwell, 42, a high school teacher. He brought his elderly mother, who'd kept a family Bible that mentioned the theft of our inheritance in 1892. She'd been laughed at by city historians who claimed the Blackwells had simply been bad at business. The third was Clara Riverside, 36, a nurse working double shifts to support 3 children. Her great-grandfather's diary mentioned the men who came in the night and threats against the children before the family sold their land for less than $1. One by one they came. 7 descendants of 7 families, all carrying fragments of stories that had been dismissed as myths or madness, all seeking validation that their ancestors hadn't been weak or foolish, but victims of something systematic and evil. Iris gathered them in a church basement, the same church where some of their ancestors had been buried after the accidents that had forced the property sales. She spread the papers across a folding table and told them everything. "We can't fight them alone," she said. "The Mercers own too much, have too many connections. But together with this evidence, we can force an investigation. We can demand justice." "Justice?" Jonas Blackwell shook his head. "The crimes happened over a century ago. Everyone involved is dead. What justice is there?" "The justice of truth," Delilah said quietly. "The justice of our family's names being cleared. The justice of the Mercers losing what they stole." "They'll come after us," Clara warned. "They've already tried to find Iris. They'll try to silence all of us." "Then we make copies," Iris said. "We distribute the evidence. We send it to newspapers, to the state attorney general, to historical societies. We make it impossible to bury." That night, they made 17 copies of everything. Each person took a set home. Iris kept the originals in the strongbox, now stored in a safety deposit box at a bank in the next county, far from Mercer influence. The next morning, Iris called the Hollowmere Tribune and asked for the investigative desk. Vincent Mercer looked different, standing in the lobby of the Tribune building, surrounded by reporters and camera crews. Smaller somehow, though he was still a tall man. His face had lost that careful neutrality, that practiced emptiness she'd seen when he sold her the funeral home. Now it showed something harder, something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. His eyes went directly to the strongbox, sitting open on the conference table, to the papers spread around it, to the 7 descendants standing beside Iris. She watched the color drain from his face before the mask tried to slip back into place. But it was too late. The cameras had caught it. The moment of recognition. The moment of fear. "Care to comment on these documents, Mr. Mercer?" the Tribune's lead investigative reporter asked. "They appear to show that your family's fortune was built on murder and theft." "Those are forgeries," Mercer said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Lies created by a desperate woman looking for attention."
Then you won't mind if we have them authenticated, the reporter pressed. We've already contacted historical document experts at 3 universities. They're eager to examine them. Iris stepped forward, Pepper in her arms for comfort. The cat had become something of a mascot for their group. The animal that had sensed danger when Iris couldn't. You sold me that funeral home for 20 cents, because you knew what was hidden there. You knew the historical survey would eventually uncover it. You thought if some broke, desperate woman found it, you could discredit her, make her look crazy or greedy. You are crazy, Mercer snapped, his composure finally cracking. Coming after my family with lies, trying to destroy a legacy built over generations. What will you do now? Clara asked Iris. You started this. You could probably write a book, do interviews. People want to know your story. Iris shook her head. This was never about me. It was about them. She gestured the building, to the crypts beneath it, where secrets of the building, to the crypts beneath it, where secrets had festered for over a century, about making sure what happened to them was remembered. That's enough. She thought about Vincent Mercer, who'd tried to sell his guilt for 20 cents, about how the weight of that guilt had crushed him in the end, not because of legal consequence. He'd avoided prison, barely, but because
The Mercer name, once synonymous with success in Hollowmere, was now synonymous with theft and murder. Some fortunes couldn't be whitewashed. Some secrets, once exposed, changed everything. Iris picked up Pepper and walked away from the Whitmore Funeral Home for the last time. Behind her, the building stood in afternoon sunlight, no longer menacing, no longer holding its breath, just a structure of brick and wood and stone, waiting to tell its story to anyone who would listen. She had bought it for 20 cents and found a secret worth $33 million, but the real value wasn't in money, it was in truth, in justice delayed but not denied, in the validation of 7 families who'd been told their memories were lies. That was worth more than any fortune built on bones.